So the second words of advice are, Christians, during this pandemic, don't forsake the suffering. A very popular passage within Christianity is Matthew chapter 25. Here Jesus tells the story of the sheep and the goats. And he says in verse 34, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed of my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world.'" And then he describes them by saying, "You are the ones who, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Of course, we know this is revolutionary. The ones who are saved, the righteous, the ones that are with Jesus are not necessarily the ones who memorize scripture, not necessarily the ones who sat in pews every week, not necessarily the ones who abstained from this evil and didn't do that and were able to pay tithe and all of those things. Yeah, those things are all well and good, but Jesus puts the judgment hinged upon how you treated who he calls the least of these. He puts the judgment based on the degree of love that you have for the suffering, for the outcast, for the weak, for the oppressed. But I want to notice something, that there are categories of suffering that Jesus highlights here. It's not just any kind of suffering that Jesus highlights. He highlights some specific kinds. He says, first, "I was hungry and you gave me something to eat." That's physical suffering. Thirsty, also physical suffering. Skip to verse 36, clothed, that's physical suffering. But there's another kind of suffering I skipped over there in verse 35. He says, "I was a stranger and you invited me in." Being a stranger, needing to be invited in, that doesn't necessarily mean you're poor. It doesn't necessarily mean you're without resources. You're just a stranger. But what you need as a stranger is something that Jesus is highlighting here. You can be suffering, not just physically, but suffering socially. The stranger, a person who comes into a society from another society, who doesn't know the language, who has maybe an accent, or who isn't familiar with the customs, who doesn't know what's going on. Socially, that individual is isolated. Socially, that individual is lonely. And Jesus says that there's suffering in our midst, and he's looking to see, are we going to reach out and attend to that suffering? So particularly during this coronavirus time, there are a lot of people who are suffering socially, a lot of people who are separated from family, separated from loved ones, separated from friends, separated from society, separated from coworkers, separated from other places that provide for them that social aspect of life that is so important for humanity. And I believe that as Christians, we need to see how I can reach out and remember those who are suffering socially, how I can relieve that suffering, how I can send a text or give a video call or just let them know that I'm thinking of them during this time, and do whatever we can to work to relieve suffering. So during this time, let's try to see how we can relieve social suffering. But there's another one. In the end of verse 36, he says, "I was in prison and you came to visit me." A prisoner has a different kind of suffering. And this is not just prisoners who are wrongfully accused. He's saying, yes, the ones who did wrong and are in prison for their wrong. What would a prisoner need? How would a prisoner be suffering? I believe prisoners that he's talking about, not saying that you came and you got me out of prison, but you came to visit me. I believe the prisoner needs some emotional support. They're suffering emotionally, maybe because they're feeling guilt for what they did wrong. Maybe they are suffering unjustly and they're down, they're discouraged, they're emotionally outcast. And so as a result of that, Jesus says, what did you do for the suffering of those who are suffering emotionally? Again, during this pandemic, there are people who are losing loved ones, and there are people who are mourning that, people who can't visit their loved ones, people who are concerned about their loved ones. There are people who during this time are unfortunately in an unhappy home as a result of this, and emotionally they're suffering. There are people who have all kinds of different challenges as a result of this pandemic, and they are suffering emotionally. Christians, during this pandemic, don't forsake the suffering. What can I do? How can I help? How can I encourage? How can I be a support, a comfort to those who are suffering? I believe this is another way that we can serve our God during this COVID-19.